after the war, obviously, and because after I was born, he was still a member of the Michigan National Guard. And we had gone out there and saw some of the planes and saw the L-4 that he flew. Now, he couldn't take us for a ride in that. But after he moved up to Boyne City, he had access to a J3, which was the civilian version of the L-4, and took us for a ride.
Nice.
My first recollection of a ride is with Butch. He and I were both in the plane, sitting in the back. Dad sat in the front. And we were over Lake Charlevoix. And the reason my memory is so clear is my cousin Butch said, Uncle Bob, do a spin. Dad said, Mike, is that all right? I had no idea what a spin was, so I said, sure. And the next thing I know, I was looking straight down at Lake Charlevoix, scared to death.
Yeah.
And didn't want to do that again.
Yeah.
So that was my first ride in a plane with Butch sitting next to me.
You must have been pretty small to be both of you
Well, yeah.
in the back seat of a J3.
Yep. I don't know what year that would be. We moved to Boyne City, I think, in 52. So it would have been 52 or 53, or it could have been after. It could have been after my parents were divorced, too, because Butch would still come up with us.
Yeah, so you'd been very young. You were born in 50, right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Huh. Yeah, I think I was 5 the first time I went up with Dad in the Cessna 180.
Okay.
I still remember the flight.
53 Delta.
Yep.
5381 Delta, sorry. Yes.
Yep.
Tell me about it. What do you remember about your first flight?
I remember we were going to go up the weekend before, and I was really mad at Eric because we were both going to go. And on the desk of the FBO there was an old fan that, of course, didn't have any guard. And Eric stuck his finger in the fan and cut his finger, and then we couldn't go flying. So I was really angry at my brother because I thought that we could still go, just leave Eric behind. But yeah, that's how we went up the next weekend, I believe. And I just remember the first takeoff. And the feeling that you get when you first go off in a light plane, just as amazing. I didn't know what it meant then, but I do have some memory of him saying what was going to happen and that he was going to climb out at VX because it was silly. This whole VY thing just didn't make any sense to him. You gained as much altitude as you could, as quickly as you could, in case something went wrong. So he goes, we're going to climb out pretty steep. Okay. And it was just, I remember looking down and going, wow, this is the coolest thing ever.
For non-pilots, the VX is your best angle of climb, and that gives you the greatest altitude in the shortest distance.
Yeah.
But VY gives you the greatest altitude in the shortest time.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Especially if you think someone's going to be shooting at you. Which one you're going to use can make a big difference if you want to get out of there.
Yeah. More clear obstacles, trees.
I had retired from the Army. I was working at the U.S. Marshal Service, and I was on my way to a meeting. And I had to go outside and walk over to the Metro in Crystal City in the Washington, D.C. area. And as I was walking to the Metro, I saw an elderly man trying to light a cigarette. I mean, he was shaking, sitting down on a bench. So I went over to him to see if I could help him. And by then, he had the cigarette lit. I saw that he was wearing a World War II cap, and I asked him if he was a veteran. Well, I didn't ask him if he was a veteran. I thanked him for his service. Obviously, he was a veteran because it said World War II veteran. And while thanking him, I noticed that he had a 4th Armored Division patch or pin on his cap. So I asked him, "Were you with the 4th Armored?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Well, what did you do?" He said, "I was the company commander of Alpha Company, 8th Tank." And I said, "Oh, well, that was Al Ertzig's outfit." And he said, "Yeah. What do you know about the 4th? And I said, "Well, my father was in the 4th Armored Division. He was a liaison pilot." And that's all I said. And this man started talking. And he said, "Oh, those Grasshopper pilots were amazing. I remember one day we had a there were two panzers behind a barn, and we were trying to get by them. So we called in the artillery. And the way the artillery worked was that a spotter plane, the L4, would come over, look, and then call in the coordinates. And he said, the next thing I know is this Grasshopper, it's what they called the L4, came over the trees, and he said, in his words, and the son of a bitch had bazookas on his wings. And he fired one of them, hit the tank, turned around, came back, fired at the other one, hit it, and flew away. And I said, how many bazookas did he have? He said, 2, I told you. I said, well, he could have had more. He said, no, this guy only had 2. Well, my dad was the only one in the 4th Armored Division to have 2 bazookas on his wings, just 2. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, 60 plus years later, I'm talking with a guy that's telling me a story about my dad. So the first thing I did, pulled out my cell phone, called my dad, and said, hey, Dad, I've got somebody here that I want you to say hi to. He was 4th Armored Division. Didn't tell him the story, didn't tell him anything else, because I knew I didn't want to taint this. So I put him on and they said hi to each other, and I was a liaison pilot, and I was with the 8th Tank and all that stuff, and they just said hi, and that was it. So I went on to my meeting, and later on that evening, I'd been thinking about it the rest of the day, I called my dad and said, do you remember a time when there were a couple of panzers behind a barn and there was a fire mission? Do you have any recollection? He said, oh yeah, I remember that. I said, well, tell me about it. And he said, yeah, we got the fire mission, 2 panzers behind a barn, and I flew over and saw, so I fired the bazooka, turned around, fired the second bazooka, and thought, what the hell am I doing here? They're shooting at me. So he said, I flew, he always flew low over the trees, and then he went in to call a mission. He said, and the mission was canceled. I said, all right. Do you know why it was canceled? He said, no, we didn't ask those questions. He was on to the next mission. I said, well, it was canceled because you hit both tanks. And he said, I've told you before, I don't think I ever hit anything. I said, Dad, you hit both tanks and you killed one of them. The other one was not killed. He said, well, how do you know? I said, because the guy I had you talk to today was telling me the story. And when he told me that you killed one tank, I said, well, how do you know he killed it? And he looked at me like I was stupid and said, that was my job. I had to know those things. And yeah, he killed one tank and he hit the other one, did some damage, but didn't kill it. And again, I'm thinking 60 plus years later, I'm hearing this story. So as I started to think about this more and more, I decided that my dad and this guy needed to get together. Well, I was, shocked enough that I didn't get his name or anything. So I called the 4th Armored Division reunion committee and eventually figured out this must be Len Kiley. He was commander of Alpha Company 8th Tank. So it took me a while to get a hold of Len, but I did, and asked him if he would be interested in meeting up with my dad, because there were not going to be any more reunions. There just were too few people. And he said, of course he would. So he said, but he has to check with his daughter, because Len was pretty aged at the time. When I called him back, he said, my daughter said, no, I can't go. I said, well, why not? He said, well, she didn't say no exactly, but she doesn't know who you are, and I'd need at least a chaperone. So I told him, okay. Either I can talk with your daughter, you can pass this information on. Go to the U.S. Marshal's website, look up my name. Now you see who I am and what I do. And then go to this website with the FAA and you'll see my pilot credentials. I would like to come and pick you up in Boston, because that's where he lived, and bring you to Michigan.
And you were field director at the time, right?
I was assistant director of the U.S. Marshals.
Yeah.
And So he said he had a friend named Lee who was willing to go with him. I said, fine, I'll come and pick you both up and we'll go. Well, as it turned out, we decided that it was better for them to fly into Milwaukee commercially, and then I would go to Milwaukee, pick them up. Now, I had arranged with my dad's wife, Karen, to do all this without letting my dad know. A couple reasons for that. One is I wanted the surprise, because that's always fun, and we do that in our family.
Yes, we do.
We do a lot of fun things. Yeah. So, and the other is I didn't know if at the last minute it was going to fail, and I didn't want him to be disappointed. So I went over to Milwaukee. Their plane landed, a commercial plane. I picked them up in my plane, flew into Grand Rapids, and we walked into the house. I walked into my dad's house first, and he said, well, hi, didn't expect you here. And then Len and Lee walked in, and my dad figured out right away, this must be the World War II veteran. It's important to note, though, that my dad was pretty ill at the time, and he was taking a lot of medication. And we all believed that he was suffering from dementia, that he was losing his mind, which was the one thing that scared him more than anything else. He wasn't afraid of dying. He wasn't afraid of a lot of things, but he did not want to lose his mental capacity. He was very smart, knew a lot of stuff. That was his fear. And we all saw that was happening. So anyway, he and Len talked for a while, and we just had a nice visit. They spent the night. And the next day, I flew Len and Lee back to Boston and thanked them. And there's a whole lot more to that story about Len and how it changed his life, affected his life too, that we can get into later if we want. But it was a good visit, but it was clear in watching them that there's a lot of things my dad didn't know, didn't remember. I mean, we knew that he was suffering from dementia. Well, we found out sometime later, and I don't know exactly when, that his mental faculties were being robbed by the medication he was taking, not for something else. So one of his doctors changed his medication and told him it would take about 6 months to really see an effect. And it did. And in 6 months, I remember telling my dad, welcome back. He was there again. So I also knew that I needed he and Len to get together again. So we arranged a time. My dad and Karen flew to D.C., where I was living at the time. And we got in the plane, my dad, Karen, and I, and flew up to Maine, where Len had a cabin. And we spent the weekend at that cabin. But this time, I was smart enough to bring a tape recorder. And all the times Len and my dad were talking, including when some other people were in the room, I had recorded. And they talked about the incident with the barn and the two Panzers. They talked about Second World War, their experiences, talked about their families after, the impact, the experiences on their families. And it was just great to hear two combat veterans talking about what they did and the impact on their lives. So, and as I said, there's a lot more to the story with Len, but sticking with my dad, we can move on from there.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think Dad was much more open about, he didn't talk a lot about the war, but he said basically he only had 2 regrets at the time, and one of them was, he described the incident with the tanks and just said, I don't know whether I hit anything. I really wish I knew.
Yeah.
So when that came forth, it's like,
this is the validation.
This is amazing.
Yeah, it really was.
Yeah.
I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And as I raised my boys, everybody has a story. You know your story, and you know some others, and you look up to them, like Dad looked up to Lindbergh. But everybody has a story. And if you just reach out to people and listen you learn so much. And if you're just kind to them, it pays back in huge dividends. I mean, I saw an elderly man trying to light a cigarette. Had I not gone over to see if he needed some help, none of this would have happened.
Right.
And noticing the 4th Armored Division.
Yeah. Yeah, I learned that too. If you're nice to talk to people, yeah.
Well, that's
it has
also
a powerful effect.
Yes, indeed. As a psychologist, yeah, you know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyway, that was the story with Len. Where do we want to go next? Well, let's talk about how he went into the Army.
Okay.
Dad, as I said, was very smart. When he and I talked about pre-World War II, he said there's a common misperception that America woke up on December 7th and were surprised that there was going to be a war. And he said no. In his recollection, it was not that way at all. Most everybody knew a war was coming and they had to go into it. But they expected the war in Europe. The surprise with the Japanese was just that it started with the Japanese. So he had talked with his parents about the future and, if we're going to have a war, all that kind of stuff. Well, in January of his senior year, one of the counselors in the school called Dad in, and he 6, 7, 8 other people, and told them that you have enough credits already to graduate now, and this was January, they would normally graduate in May or June. If you would like to leave school to join the military, we will let you, and we'll make sure you get your diploma in June or May, whenever it was. So Dad thought that would be a great idea, principally because once the war started, everybody's going in with a lot of numbers and all that stuff and get lost in the shuffle. But if you joined early, you'd have a greater chance of getting what you wanted to do, and you'd have some seniority when the masses start joining. So he talked with his parents, and his dad our grandpa thought that was a good idea. His mother didn't. She cried, and not surprising. The problem was that Dad wasn't going to turn 18 until April 29th, and that you couldn't join even with parental permission until you were 18. So my dad asked his parents to lie for him so he could join the Army, and his father agreed. And they went down to the enlistment station, and Dad enlisted. Asked how old he was. He said 18. His father was standing there and agreed with it. He was 18. And that was it. And he said, okay. They gave him a very cursory physical, told to go home and come back the next day ready to go. And he went back the next day with his pack, a little bag of stuff he needed, and said he and his father walked to the station, took the streetcar to the station, and as he said, they're both men now, so nobody could cry in public, but they both felt it.
Yeah.
And they hugged, and he said he watched my grandfather turn around and walk off to work as Dad went into the station.
Now, what city was this?
This was in Detroit.
Okay.
Yeah. This was all done in Detroit. They lived in Highland Park. He went to Highland Park High School. So he was off. He wanted to be a pilot. He was when he got to the first station. Actually, it was in Detroit. They swore them in, and then they did a physical. He said 2 people didn't pass the physical, so they had to be let go. And I know this from Dad had written an autobiography for the family and a number of these things. So this isn't just my recollection.
Yeah.
So he went off to his first station and was told that he had a color deficiency, so he couldn't become a pilot or an officer. And he he never thought about being an officer. I mean, but he really wanted to be a pilot. And at this point, I really ought to step back and tell the Lindbergh story. And you know it too. My dad's hero and why he wanted to be a pilot was Charles Lindbergh. When he was in Lindbergh, my dad was born in 1923. Lindbergh flew to New York to Paris in 1927. Shortly after Lindbergh completed the flight, like within 6 months, he had written a book. And it wasn't ghostwriting. Lindbergh was quite a writer. Wrote a book called WE, W-E. It was about he and his plane. My dad read that book. As I said, he was very bright. So he was, 4 years old? It could have been 5 years old when he read it, but he read the book. And Charles Lindbergh was his hero. Now, that's not uncommon in the States and around the world. Charles Lindbergh was the hero. Everybody looked at such an amazing flight. Well, that got my dad really interested in flying. So that's why he really wanted to do this. Well, in 1929, there were the Cleveland Air Races. My grandfather took my father to the Cleveland Air Races because my dad was so interested in flying and all that stuff. Well, while there was a Ford trimotor, and my grandfather asked my dad, said, well, you've always wanted to fly. How'd you like to go for your first plane ride? It was $5. And in 1929, that was a lot of money. So as Brian recalls my dad telling the story, there wasn't enough money for both of them, so my dad went, because that's what my grandfather was about. You want to be a pilot, you always love flying, here's your opportunity. I don't recall it that way. I thought they both got on the plane, but I could easily and likely wrong, because the $5 a person was a lot of money.
Yeah.
Well, as my dad tells the story, he got on the plane. It was a Ford trimotor. And he said, the co-pilot turned around and said, ladies and gentlemen, I have a real treat for you today. Let me introduce you to your pilot, Charles Lindbergh. And Charles Lindbergh then turned around and said, folks, let's have a great flight. And they flew this plane. His hero, and now his first plane ride was being flown by Charles Lindbergh.
Yeah.
So that is just so cool a story. And now I'm going to jump further ahead. In picture number 12, my dad and I went to AirVenture in Oshkosh. And the picture shows the L4 with the Brody system on it, Brody hook. While we were there was a Ford trimotor, and my dad said to me, he said, well, you know the story. You want to go for a trimotor ride? I said, absolutely. Now, I was already a pilot, but, and I don't recall how much it cost, but my dad paid for it. And we both got on the Ford trimotor, and we were sitting there. And I asked him if he remembered where he was sitting, and he did not, because we wanted to try to get the same type of seats. And these were cane seats. I mean, this is the way it was originally. And we went up and flew around, and so we were in a trimotor together. Well, the following month, the Flying magazine came out, and on the picture was the Ford trimotor that my dad and I were in. And I thought, oh, cool. So I got the magazine, and I'm reading it, and it talks about Oshkosh and all that stuff. And as I'm reading the article, it says the Ford trimotor, blah, the history, blah, blah, once flown by Charles Lindbergh at the 1929 Cleveland Air Races.
Same plane.
My dad and I were on the same plane he took his first ride with Charles Lindbergh. That is really cool.
Yeah.
Keeping with the trimotor, did you want to?
I was going to say, what I heard Dad say, going back to the first one, the first plane ride, so he's, very young, and gets off and tells, Charles Lindbergh was the pilot. And he was basically told, that couldn't possibly be true, you must have heard wrong. And so it planted a seed of doubt as to whether that actually happened, because he was very young. And when they went to AirVenture, and it was found out that in fact that was even the plane that Lindbergh apparently had done a lot of promotional flights for Ford and the trimotor. By doing that type of thing, it validated that his memory was indeed accurate. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So jumping ahead, but keeping with the Ford, the flying and the trimotor theme, my dad became very ill, and it was clear he was terminal. So I asked him, I had retired from federal service at the time, and spent a fair amount of time in Grand Rapids with him. And I asked him, I said, what's on your bucket list? And he said, nothing. And I said, oh, come on, there's got to be something you want to do. What can we do? Well, as it turned out, getting him to talk, there were three things that he wanted to do. First is he wanted to fly an L4. I worked very hard, but could not do that and was unsuccessful. He passed before I had access to an L4, or could get anybody with an L4 to go to him or do anything. The second thing he wanted to do is he wanted to go take his family for a ride in a Ford trimotor. So we arranged that. A Ford trimotor from Oshkosh was visiting Kalamazoo, Michigan, on their tour going around showing the old birds, and they're selling flights. Well, we rented the whole plane. I mean, the whole plane was like 12, 13 people.
Yeah.
It wasn't,
right.
I mean, it's not huge. And all of his children, all of his surviving children, we had lost a sister by then, and then some of their spouses and grandkids. And we got on a plane and flew in the Ford trimotor. Mm-hmm. And actually, I didn't send you pictures of that, but I do have those pictures. So if you remind me, because the pilot made a point of congratulating him, and then I have a picture of the whole family, everybody that went flying, and the Russ family that were there in front of the trimotor. Mm-hmm. So, and then the third thing he wanted to do is he said that he wanted to go, he had always, but he'd wanted to go to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. But he couldn't go. And I said, why can't you go? He said, I'm in a wheelchair. I have this, come on, people in wheelchairs travel places every day. So we arranged it. Brian and I, Karen and my dad flew to New Orleans and spent 5 days?
Yeah, I think that's right.
5 days.
Yeah.
Because I thought that we'd go through the museum in a day or two, but no. Every day for the 5 days, they were in that museum looking at things, bringing back memories, talking about stuff. And Brian and I and the rest of the family were delighted that we were able to help him do that.
Yeah, it was quite an experience.
Yep. And,
you could only handle a couple hours and we'd have to leave.
Yep.
We'd get very tired, but glad we had the time.
Well, yeah, we did do a couple hours, so we'd take a long break and then go back for a little more, but we were there every day. Mm-hmm. I had been there before and had told him about it, but when I was there, the first time it was called the D-Day Museum, and it was all about D-Day and the war in Europe. By the time we went back, it had expanded to the World War II Museum. It had some in the Pacific, and it's expanded even further than. It's a lot bigger now than it was even when we were there. He finally became the pilot he wanted to be.
Yes, let's do that. That's
okay.
And this tells you a lot about not only my father, but our family, I think, is the way we go about life. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So he was, when he enlisted, he wanted to be a pilot, but he was told he couldn't be because of this color deficiency. So he went into photography.
He was red-green colorblind.
Yes. He was bored out of his mind after the first little bit in learning photography and learned what they could teach at the time, and just bored. And he saw a notice on the board that the Army needed glider pilots. And there was no color vision requirement for glider pilots. And he thought, well, at least this will get me in the air. So he signed up for it and was accepted and started glider training. And the gliders at the time were all towed up by bigger planes and then released and would land. I don't know how far he got into the training. I'm not even certain he ever flew a glider, but he was a passenger in them to see how it was done, because the next bulletin he noticed was the Army was looking for liaison pilots. And now you're flying a powered aircraft, and it didn't say anything about a color vision requirement. So he signed up, was accepted, and went off to the training. Now, people weren't using planes for liaison, for calling in artillery, until, and you read some of the military history, there were a few people that were really behind this. One of them was a guy by the name of Patton, who was also a pilot and recognized the capabilities of small planes in helping not only call in artillery, but direct movements and providing commanders a view of the battlefield that they couldn't see any other way. So the Army decided to bring in a lot of people and train liaison pilots. So my dad applied. He went to flight school. He was the first one in his class to solo. And he had a guy in his class by the name of Piper, who was the son of Piper of the Piper Cub fame. And he tells a story about that there's one day, the winds were pretty strong, so they were told they weren't going to fly. And Piper and another guy made a bet. Piper said that he could land the planes in the chocks. So he could just set it down right in the chocks. And of course, people took the bet. When Piper came in the first time and landed in the chalk, but bounced out because he hit too hard. It bounced out, forward momentum, so he was out. Came back the second time, was short. Came back the third time, was a short, and he only had 3 tries, so he didn't do it. That's pretty impressive flying.
That's very impressive.
That's pretty impressive stuff.
Yeah.
So anyway, my dad was the first one to solo, and was just about to get his wings when his medical file caught up with him. And as I understand it, the commander was told that my dad was not qualified, could not do it, but both the commander and the flight instructor said, "You got to be kidding me. This guy is a great pilot and we need him." So they overlooked the color deficiency and let him continue. They didn't give him a waiver. They just overlooked it and let him go.
Yeah. So I heard it too, that one of the reasons he was accepted, because they gave preference to people with flight experience. And although he was being at the beginning stages of glider training, that was still considered flying experience. So
Yep. So that's why he went into an early class.
Yeah.
So he did his training in a couple different places. A lot of the flight training was done in Texas. I don't know where he started, probably Texas, and then he was at Fort Sill. And then, because he was assigned to the Field Artillery, and was part of 4th Armored Division. 4th Armored Division was doing their Louisiana training under Patton, but they were, where my dad was involved was when they were out in the desert in California. And he, P. Wood, P was for Professor Wood, was the John Shirley Wood, I believe, was the commanding general of the 4th Armored Division at the time. And he also was learning or understood the value of planes. So he would use the plane. He wouldn't be up in it. He would use the plane to start things. Like, you can imagine a column of vehicles. Let's say it's small. It's 20 people, let alone 100, to get them all started at the same time. Well, if you do it over the radio, so everybody start rolling now, there's going to be some hesitation in both, the radios, and people have a tendency to watch for the vehicle in front of them to move before they move, which of course now you have this long accordion and then it tries to catch up. And that had been one of the problems all along in mass movements. Well, the plane would go up there, my dad, and he would give the order. He'd get it and say, and start moving now. And all the drivers were expected to start moving right then, and would realize this is how you could get a column and keep it together, keep the integrity for their defense, not cause any gaps. So they used the time in California really to train for combat, but to train and try new things, which is why 4th Armored Division was the spearhead of Patton's Third Army, because of their relationship. And also, they had another really great commander there. Wood was the commander of the division, but they had a guy by the name of Creighton Abrams, who was one of the battalion commanders at the time, who then got promoted to colonel and was a combat, one of the combat commands, and later on retired, passed away as the chief of staff of the Army, 4-star. So they had some great people in that unit that were working.
There's a tank named after him now.
Yeah, the Abrams tank was named after. Yeah. Well, and Al Ertzig was the 8th tank, and Len Kiley, I already talked about. Len got out of active. He stayed in the reserve, so he was able to retire from the Army. But these guys had a lot of combat experience, a lot of combat knowledge, and knew this isn't something you just do by the book. The book provides a guide, but you have to be able to adjust from it. And they learned to adjust, and adjust well, and that's why they're so successful. So anyway, when my dad, on his first solo at flight school, when he was told he was solo, I think every pilot I know remembers their first solo. They can tell you when it was, where it was, how they felt, and all that stuff. My dad said that as soon as he was in the air, the first thing he said was, "Hi-yo, Silver!" Well, he grew up in Detroit. Brace Beamer played the character of the Lone Ranger, and he used to listen to it on the radio, and it was like, "Hi-yo, Silver!" And he was soloing a plane for the first time. It was great.
Yeah, Dad said that the first time he got in an airplane, he just knew what to do. It just came so naturally to him. So.
Yeah.
And
and as a liaison pilot, in training, let alone in combat, you're not going to land at an airport, because there aren't going to be airports where you want to go, and they're not. It could be short fields, small fields, grassy fields, no fields, curved roads. You've got to be able to do this stuff. So out in the desert, they practiced this stuff. Some practice sanctioned, some practices not sanctioned.
Yes.
Like there was a time that a train was going through their training area. So my dad went over and landed on a moving train and took off again. Didn't stop the engine, just landed, touched the wheels on it, and took off again. So because they were playing around with what you could do and how you do things.
Yep.
And, I'm a flight instructor. I teach people to fly, but we don't teach that stuff. That's, way advanced stuff. But these are people that, he probably had 100 hours in a plane. Not too much more at the time, because you trained people, got them, and then you went out and did some things. So anyway, they used the planes to coordinate starting convoy starts. Here's another little story about my dad. The pilots, in a unit, they have something called Officer of the Day. It's usually, it's an extra duty, usually at night. Everybody else goes home, but they have to have an officer on staff. So the pilots would get tapped for this, and they decided to make a bet to see who would do it. I mean, there's a roster, but you could trade with somebody. So the way they did it is they would race their planes around a course, and whoever lost was the Officer of the Day. Whoever won, the next time they raced, another pilot could claim that plane. So my dad never lost, but never won. He knew that, I didn't want him to take his plane. He loved it, so he flew the course so that...
Yeah, he came in second almost every time.
Yep.
It tells you a lot about our father.
Why give up the
It's
plane?
like there's a system here, and I don't want to be on the bad end of that, so I'm going to figure out how to work it.
And he did.
He did.
So, and we grew up hearing and knowing about things like that.
Yes.
So,
yeah, he wasn't ashamed of that.
no, it's it's a thinking skill.
Yeah.
You weren't cheating anybody, and so anyway, when 4th Armored Division deployed or left the continental U.S., they went to England, and they did a lot of training in England, waiting for D-Day. A couple things happened that I thought were interesting. England's known for a lot of fog. My dad took off one day, the fog came in and wasn't going out, and he knew where he was over England approximately. It's not like today with GPS, but he was looking for a place to get through, and fortunately he finally found an area that had enough of an opening that he could go through and land and then let people know where he was. But that's the kind of flying you did back then. Mm-hmm. He got called in by his commander one day and said, I need you to take a package to London for me. I said, okay. Well, London at the time, it was warfare. They had what are called barrage balloons. And a barrage balloon is simply a huge balloon, helium-filled or something else, up in the air and held in place or in the general area with cables. And the reason for that is the balloons didn't do much except hold the cables up. So if the German planes were trying to come in, they'd hit cables. So it not good for their health to try to do that. But in these barrage balloons, there were corridors, and if you knew the corridor, you could fly to where you needed to go. So the commanding officer gave my dad the package, told him who to deliver it to, and gave him the chart on how to get through the barrage balloons, because they changed them. It wasn't the same thing every day. So he took his L4s, Piper Cub, flew in, landed, went to the unit that he was supposed to deliver this package to the commanding officer. And one of the sergeants or first sergeant said, I'll take it and give it to him. My dad said, no, I was told to deliver it to him personally. So he was brought into this colonel's office, handed him the package, said, oh, I've been expecting this. Thanks. And my dad said, if you don't mind, can you tell me what I just delivered? And the colonel laughed, said, yeah, sure. And he opened up, and it was a bottle of bourbon that his boss had lost in a bet. So he was paying off a bet. So thinking, holy cow, you're giving the map how to get through the barrage balloons to deliver a bet. Well, since I spent 24 plus years in the Army, that doesn't surprise me like it used to. Yeah, I understand how those things happen. Yeah. On before D-Day, everybody in Europe or was wondering when the invasion was going to take place and who would go. Well, when it did go, and if you know the different units, 4th Armored was not in the initial invasion on D-Day. And the reason for that was the plan was that once the beachheads were secured, they were going to go in and secure the ports at Cherbourg and then be able to move from there. Well, at D+7, when things were still hot on the beaches, not as bad as they were, but things were hot, my dad was tasked with taking a senior officer, and I don't know who, to Omaha Beach. And it was they're still being shot at there. And as he said, he came in, he landed on the beach, the plane was still rolling when this guy got out because they're being shot at. And then he just kept the plane going and went back to England. So.
Yeah.
So then 4th Armored Division went in, and their job was to secure the ports at Cherbourg, which was done, or mostly done, when the decision was made that they could really start their drive to the east. And Patton wanted the ports, and they were going to be secure, and they started driving east. And as I said, 4th Armored was the spearhead. They have, in fact, I'm sure they still have the record for the most continuous days in combat of any U.S. unit. And, my dad was a liaison pilot for him. The Piper Cub, the L4, was designed to be flown from the back seat. You didn't have the visibility for what they needed, so they put their radio back there for the weight, and the pilot sat in the front. He took the steel grid or grill from a stove, the steel pot, and sat on that because bullets from below can come in anyway.
Yes.
And that was
he used to call it protecting the family jewel.
Yes, he did. Yep. And so that's what he sat on to protect from there.
Yep.
He was shot down at least 3 times that I know of, and I think more. And by shot down, it wasn't while he was high in the air, because the L4s knew that they were slow planes, so if you want to stay safe, you needed to stay low, so that by the time they could hear you, but by the time they saw you, they could get a shot or 2 off, that's it, and you were gone. If you were higher, they'd see you for longer and could shoot you.
How high up would they fly typically?
20 feet above the trees. Because what you're looking for, you could pop up for a bit and go right back down to get a better view, because what they were looking for was enemy formations. And of course you could see, if it was tanks or rolling stock vehicles, you could see the dust, so that you knew about where things were, and now you knew where to head to get a closer look. Or you could pop up, look for something if people weren't moving, like artillery, and so that you could go in and call on them. Well, the L4, and I have a video over there that I want to show you. I want to let you see the cover, and then I'll loan it to you if you want, because it's pretty amazing. It turns out that the Germans had a bounty on L4s because they were so effective. And they were so effective because this little plane, and it's called the little plane that did, called in so much artillery, so much destruction on enemy forces, that if you look at it as a matter of combat capability, combat units rendered incapable, destroyed or incapable, the L4 did more damage than anybody else in the war. The only area that gets more credit is if you do it by tonnage. Those that sink ships.
Right.
Yeah. But for combat casualties, the L4, the liaison, did more damage than anything. So there's a bounty on them. I mean, think about it, during the war, especially when the Germans started having to retreat, they were giving passes to any soldier that was able to bring down an L4.
Yeah.
So L4s were targets, and when my dad was shot down, it was almost always, well, it was always on landing, where a plane or somebody close was shooting at them to try and get them while they're slow. And he said he wasn't worried about the German planes, fighters, Messerschmitts and that, because, as he said, it's like a chicken in a road. You want to aim your car at it, fine. You get as close as you can, the chicken will step to the side and there's nothing you can do, and he's out of sight. Because it was so slow, the L4 could maneuver very quickly and get out of the way. So the Messerschmitts would come in and shoot at them and then get out of the area. They'd take a couple shots, but because their best opportunity is if the L4 didn't know where they were or didn't see them. Well, once they shot at them, they knew where they were and they knew what to look for.
Plus they're low, and if they come around again, they're vulnerable to ground fire as well.
Absolutely.
So they would take one pass and
Yep.
they'd be gone.
Normally.
Yeah.
But one time,
Yeah.
the L4 or the Messerschmitt shot at him and missed, and he went into land, and it came back, and it shot at him while he was landing and cut the tail of the plane off. So
Literally.
literally cut it off physically. And he got out of the plane, knew it was damaged badly, and his mechanic came over to him and said, "Can you come to the plane for a minute?" He said, "Yeah." Why? He said, just want to check something." He said, "Okay. You were sitting up front?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Go ahead and get in the plane." He couldn't. The engine was there. He had gotten out of that plane before the full impact.
He didn't remember that, but he figures he must have been about 15 feet off the ground when he jumped out.
Yeah. How high? I don't know, but he was not in that plane when it crashed.
And he didn't remember doing it, but
Nope.
obviously he had, because
He could not fit in there.
yeah,
Amazing stuff.
yeah.
So he was shot down a few times. He was also reported killed in combat. And fortunately, they were able to, the telegram had already been sent back, but they were able to stop it before it was delivered to his parents. And what had happened is, from his story, he was flying along when a Messerschmitt came and shot at him. Well, there was a valley, so he went down in the valley, knowing that the Messerschmitt couldn't follow him in there because he was too fast. And then he flew along the valley for a while. Well, one of the other liaison planes that was up, because they often flew two at a time, saw him dive and not come up. So he reported him killed in action. And as I said, there was enough time that they'd sent the telegram home when he landed and showed up. And his adjutant said, "Oh my God, stop that telegram, stop that from going out." Mm-hmm. Well, it had already gone out, but it was not delivered to his parents yet. I mean, it had gone out from their headquarters in Europe. So,
Yeah, one thing I think I didn't understand until, Dad told me this towards the end of his life, is that, there was no GPS. It was all, figure it out. And the front line was always moving, and his job was to go over the front line to find the enemy. And so you almost never landed where you took off. You had to figure out where your people were now and then land. And so it was an amazingly difficult job. And just so, because you don't know where you're going to have to land or what the circumstances are going to be if and when you do that. And they came up with rules about, okay, if you can't find it, this is what you do. You don't get altitude because that makes you a target. If you're lost, even, he goes, I think they said you fly
west
until you see friendly forces, then you land, and then they can radio where you are, and you can figure out how to get back. So is that kind of just constantly in danger? And he said he spent a lot of his time, what if this happens? What am I going to do if this, okay, but if this happens, what am I going to do? Because he knew that if you waited until it happened, you were probably going to die. And he credits a lot of his, I think, success even in later life with that mindset. It's okay, let's go through every possible scenario you can think of, and I'm going to figure out what I'm going to do if. And he credits that with his survival.
Oh, absolutely. The what if.
There was an incredibly high mortality rate. Obviously, that very dangerous job.
Well, along those lines, the two things. One is the division, or the 22nd Field Artillery, Army Field Artillery Battalion started with 7 pilots when they went into Europe. Dad was the only one that survived of those 7.
Yeah.
So, and what Brian said about the job was to go over the lines, find the enemy and call in artillery. And it's more than just calling artillery. Let them know what was there in the type of unit, so the intelligence can determine, all right, what's going on back there? What are they trying to do? But often he'd fly over the lines and he'd know where the lead American forces were. And then he'd look for where the Germans were, and there was a gap in between there. Sometimes it made sense to land in that gap and let your units come up. One day he did this, and boy, he's very emotional when he told me this story, and I want you to jump in too, because he landed. This was getting near the end of the war, where the Germans were using everything they could, the elderly, the young kids, to fight, putting them in uniforms or anything. He landed his L4 in an open field. Oh, by the way, open fields. The kind of field you choose are the kind that have livestock in it. Well, that seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But the reason you do that is if there's livestock, they're moving and there are no mines. If it's just an open field, the enemy may have mines in that field. So you looked at a place where there's livestock, and that's where you landed. Well, he landed in this one field and got out, waiting for the 4th Armored Division to move up to where he was. When out of the tree line, there was a line of children. He said the oldest one looked to be maybe 13, but their ages between 8 and 13. Walking side by side, a fair amount of distance apart, each one of them with one hand behind their back. And he thought, I don't know what this is. Do they have hand grenades? Do they have rocks? Do they have nothing? Are they just trying to scare me? So he carried a machine gun, a Tommy gun, in his plane. Most didn't. Most just had this .45 as sidearm. And he fired a burst in the air. He didn't stop them. They kept coming. So he looked at the oldest kid, and he fired a burst at it near his feet, certainly in front of this kid. And he stopped. And they all stopped. And then my dad took the Tommy gun and just aimed it at the kid. And he and the others turned and ran away. To this day, he doesn't know what they have in their hands. What he knows is he stood there and threw up at the idea of almost killing a bunch of kids. Or he was going to die himself. And that was the position he was in. So,
Yeah.
Go on.
No, that's what he told me too. That he immediately just threw up.
Yeah.
That was just
one of the things you talked about, regrets. He talked about, one of them was, and he's quoted in, I think it was a Post magazine, but I have searched and cannot find the article, or Life or something like that. But I remember reading the article because my grandparents saved it. He was quoted in the magazine that was chronicling the war while it was happening. And my dad had noticed that these units were moving at the same time every day in the same manner. So
German units.
Yeah, German units. So what they did is he had timed it and decided that if when they get to this point, he can use artillery to take out the lead tank and the back tank, the others had no place to go. And then they could wipe them out or they could surrender or something. And did that. And it worked. And in the article, he was quoted as saying that that German commander was really dumb. I wish they were all that way. And he really regretted that because the Germans were not dumb, and they fought. They were soldiers. I retired as a soldier. This was the enemy because they were the enemy. They were still people, and you respected what they did and how they did it, and you learned from them. But he really regretted having said that and having it printed, because it's, he didn't feel that way about the Germans. And this is a good time to bring in Hogan's Heroes.
Yeah, I mean, when I was growing up, the show Hogan's Heroes was on, and for people who don't know, it was set in a German prison camp, basically. And my father refused to watch that show. And we would, typical family in those days. The shows would come on and Hogan's Heroes would come out, and he would leave. And we just didn't understand that until we asked him one point, and he goes, "This show makes the Germans look stupid." He goes, "They were not stupid. They were defending their country. They were doing their duty. And I will not watch a show that, puts out there that these people were just dumb." And that was a life lesson. I didn't realize it at the time, but respecting all people was huge. All through his life. As clinical director of the hospital. That's later, but that played out there and everywhere, and really taught us that lesson.
These are the life lessons, some of the life lessons we learned from him.
Yeah.
There was another incident of a train. There was a tunnel. And what my dad had figured and others had figured is the ammunition trains for the Germans had to go through that tunnel. If they could just be patient and wait, they could use, for a train to go in there, they can use artillery to seal off the front end and the back end of the tunnel, and then it wasn't a matter of just digging things away, especially if they could cause some type of fire so the train exploded with all those munitions. And they were successful. Train started in, they used artillery to close off the exit. The train can't stop on a dime. Used artillery to close off the exit, but there were still parts of the train there that exploded with the ammunition. They were able to destroy the whole tunnel. So it took the train out and took that means of resupplying troops away.
Yeah. Again, because, as I heard it, because the Germans, especially the rail system, was so precise. It was to the second. Obviously they're known for that. And that they knew exactly when that train was going to be going, and they couldn't obviously seal it off until they knew the train was committed. Otherwise they just stopped.
On a future note on that, back in 1977, I was a captain in the Army and was assigned to Germany. I was with the 1st Armored Division, and we had this big exercise coming up called Reforger, Return of Forces to Germany, where major units, division-sized units, were coming from the States, and then we'd fight war games, and then they'd go back. Well, I was military police, so we went to this big conference on how